Did people really believe the world was flat? Did every knight wear shining armor? What if what you thought you knew about reading and writing in the Middle Ages, that incredible stretch of history from about 500 CE to 1500 CE, was just plain wrong? Get ready, because we are about to pull back the curtain on some seriously twisted tales. Number 6. The monastic monopoly. There's this idea that often pops up, like a knight's helmet in historical drama, suggesting that the only people who could read or write during the Middle Ages were monks and a few very rare, very powerful church figures. The thought is that literacy was holed up in monasteries, hidden away behind thick stone walls with dusty manuscripts and flickering candlelight. The rest of the world, so this common story goes, was simply stumbling around in a fog of illiteracy, unable to make sense of any squiggles on parchment. It paints a picture of a society where the vast majority of people were completely cut off from anything written, where information only spread by word of mouth, and where the written word held an almost mystical, untouchable power for the common person. This view often assumes that if you were not wearing a cowl and living a life of quiet contemplation, then books, letters, and documents were just fancy decorations, completely meaningless symbols. The idea is that the church, specifically its monastic orders, was the sole guardian of knowledge, holding the keys to all learning and literacy, doling it out only in carefully measured doses to a select few. But hold on a minute. While it is certainly true that monasteries were crucial centers of learning and manuscript production, acting as vital repositories of knowledge, saying they had an absolute monopoly on literacy is a bit like saying only professional bakers know how to make bread. Many people were baking bread outside the professional bakeries, just as many people were engaging with the written word outside the cloistered walls of a monastery. The reality of medieval literacy was far more varied, far more spread out, and far more practical than this narrow view suggests. It was not just about transcribing ancient texts or studying theology. Literacy, in its different forms, served many purposes for many different people across the social spectrum. It was a tool for commerce, for law, for governance, for personal communication, and even for simple daily record-keeping. Think about the bustling world of trade. Merchants, for example, were often far from the quiet scholarly life of a monk, yet they absolutely needed to be able to read and write. How else would they keep track of their complex accounts? How would they record transactions involving goods from distant lands, goods that might change hands multiple times before reaching their final destination? Imagine a merchant caravanning across Europe, dealing in spices from the East, wool from England, or wine from France. They needed to write contracts with suppliers, keep ledgers of sales and purchases, and manage credit with customers they might not see again for months or even years. These were not just quick mental calculations. These were detailed financial records that determined their livelihood. A merchant could not just trust everything to memory or to a verbal agreement. Disputes arose, and written proof was often the only way to settle them. Bills of exchange, letters of credit, shipping, manifests. These were the lifeblood of medieval commerce, and they all demanded a degree of literacy from those who handled them. These documents were often written in various languages, not just Latin, requiring merchants to be multilingual as well as literate, a skill monks certainly possessed, but for very different reasons. Then there are the people involved in law and administration. Every local lord, every town council, every royal court needed individuals who could read and write. Charters, decrees, legal proceedings, property deeds, tax records. These were all foundational to the operation of society. Scribes were employed by nobles, by city governments, and by wealthy landowners. These scribes were not necessarily monks. They were often lay professionals who earned their living by their pen. They might draft wills, record court judgments, or draw up marriage contracts. The chanceries of kings and queens, the courts of dukes and counts, the offices of mayors and aldermen, all hummed with the activity of lay clerks and secretaries diligently putting pen to parchment. These were people deeply embedded in the secular world, directly involved in the governance and legal frameworks of their time. They needed to understand complex legal jargon, translate oral testimony into written records, and ensure that documents were legally binding. This was not the work of secluded monastics. It was the work of pragmatic professionals who operated in the very public sphere. Consider also the burgeoning towns and cities. As urban centers grew, so did the need for literacy. Guilds, which were organizations of craftsmen and merchants, often had written rules, regulations, and membership lists. Their members needed to be able to understand these rules, and sometimes even contribute to them. Town clerks, who managed the affairs of the city, were indispensable. They kept records of births, deaths, marriages, property, ownership, and judicial rulings. These were the historical database of their time, and they required a steady hand and a clear head. People involved in urban administration were often literate in the vernacular language of their region, not just Latin, because they were dealing with the everyday lives of the townsfolk. This practical, administrative literacy was far removed from the theological studies pursued in monasteries. Even among the nobility, while not every knight or lady was a scholar, literacy was far from absent. Many nobles, especially those managing vast estates, needed to read and write letters, manage their household accounts, and review official documents. They might employ a private chaplain or a clerk to handle much of the detailed paperwork, but they often needed to be able to comprehend the contents themselves, particularly when signing their names to important treaties or property transfers. A noble who could not read a letter from the king or understand the details of a marriage contract would be at a significant disadvantage, easily manipulated or misled. Education for noble children, both boys and girls, sometimes included reading and writing, not just for religious instruction but for practical governance and household management. There are records of noble women managing large estates in their husband's absence, overseeing finances and correspondence, tasks that would be incredibly difficult without some level of literacy. They might not be copying ancient texts, but they were certainly engaging with the written word as a tool for power and management. And what about the average person, the farmer or the craftsman? While they might not have owned libraries or written complex treatises, their interaction with the written word was not entirely non-existent. They might hear proclamations read aloud in the town square, bringing news from the king or new regulations. They might witness the signing of a legal document and understand its implications. They might have a local priest who could read the Bible or liturgical texts to them, thus engaging with the written word through oral transmission. While direct personal literacy was less common among the peasantry, it was not an absolute void. The line between being able to read and write and being completely illiterate was not a sharp, unyielding barrier. Some people could read but not write, or vice versa, or could only read certain types of texts. Some could recognize their name or simple symbols, even if they could not read a whole book. The idea of literacy itself was more fluid and functional than our modern concept of universal school-based learning. Finally, consider the evolution of education. While monasteries provided crucial early education, over time schools began to emerge outside monastic control. Cathedral schools, for example, often taught both clerical and lay students. By the later Middle Ages, urban grammar schools focused on preparing students for university or for careers in law or administration became more common. Universities themselves, centers of advanced learning, attracted students from various backgrounds, not just those destined for the church. These institutions were training grounds for literate professionals who would go on to serve in all areas of medieval society, from medicine to engineering to government. This diverse educational landscape clearly shows that literacy was not confined to a single sacred institution. So, while we absolutely must acknowledge the immense contribution of monks to preserving knowledge and fostering scholarship, painting them as the sole custodians of literacy misses the vibrant, messy, and very practical reality of medieval society. Literacy existed in many forms, served many masters, and was practiced by many hands outside the cloister. It was a skill that in varying degrees underpinned the daily operations of commerce, law, governance, and even household life for many people across the diverse landscape of the Middle Ages. The world was far from a monochromatic scene of widespread illiteracy, with only the monastic order holding the light. It was a place where different levels of reading and writing ability were intertwined with the very fabric of daily existence, a far cry from a strict monastic monopoly. Number 5. The script scramble. There is this common idea that if you were illiterate in the Middle Ages, you were completely and utterly cut off from all written information. It is like imagining a world where a person who cannot read the letters on a page is entirely blind to the meaning of any document, any sign, any symbol. The misconception suggests that there was an insurmountable wall between the written word and the person who could not read it for themselves. It implies that if you could not personally decipher the squiggles on parchment, then a contract, a royal decree, a deed, or even a simple letter was nothing more than a meaningless collection of lines completely inaccessible and incomprehensible. This perspective often leads to the assumption that an illiterate person lived in a silent world concerning written communication, completely reliant on second-hand oral accounts, unable to grasp the true weight or content of official documents, even if they were present when such documents were being used or created. It is the idea that not being able to read meant total exclusion from the world of literacy, leaving one vulnerable and uninformed. However, the reality of medieval life was far more nuanced and complex than this stark picture. The relationship between people and the written word was not simply a binary, can read or cannot read. There were many layers of interaction, many ways in which people, even those who could not personally read or write, engaged with and understood the meaning of documents and symbols. Literacy was not just a personal skill. It was a social and communal practice, often involving intermediaries and visual cues that made the written world accessible even to the non-literate. The ability to understand the implications of a written document, even without being able to read it word for word, was a crucial part of medieval life. People developed strategies and relied on social structures to bridge the gap between their own literacy levels and the demands of a society that increasingly used written records. One of the most important ways illiterate people accessed written information was through oral culture. This was not a passive reception. It was an active part of how information moved through society. Official documents such as royal proclamations, town statutes, or legal judgments were very often read aloud in public spaces. Imagine a town crier, standing in the market square, unrolling a parchment and loudly proclaiming its contents to a gathered crowd. Everyone, literate or not, would hear the news, understand the new laws, or learn about important events. In church, sermons were delivered, and biblical passages were read aloud, often accompanied by explanations and interpretations, making sacred texts accessible to the entire congregation, regardless of their reading ability. This oral transmission ensured that vital information reached a broad audience, not just those who could read it privately. The very act of a document being read aloud in a formal setting gave it authority and presence, making its content known to all who were present. Beyond public readings, personal intermediaries played a massive role. If a merchant received a letter and he himself was not fully literate, he would have a clerk, a scribe, or even a trusted family member read it to him. If a peasant needed to understand a legal contract about their land, they would go to the local priest, the village notary, or a literate neighbor to have it explained. These individuals acted as vital bridges, translating the written word into spoken language, allowing the illiterate person to grasp the content and make informed decisions. This was not a sign of weakness. It was a standard practice, woven into the social fabric. The person hearing the document read might not be able to read it themselves, but they could understand its implications, ask questions, and even challenge its contents through their intermediary. Transaction was still happening. The information was still flowing, just through a different channel. Furthermore, medieval documents often incorporated visual cues and symbolic elements that conveyed meaning beyond the text itself. Seals, for example, were incredibly important. A royal seal, a lord's seal, or a town's seal affixed to a document was not just a pretty wax impression. It was a powerful symbol of authenticity and authority. Even if you could not read the words of a charter, seeing the king's great seal attached to it immediately told you that it was an official, legitimate document. It carried weight and power. The specific type of script used, the decorative initials, or the layout of a document could also convey information about its importance or its origin. These visual elements provided a layer of non-textual communication that illiterate people could interpret and understand, offering clues about the document's nature even without reading its words. Another crucial aspect was the importance of signatures and marks. While many people could not write their names, they could often make a mark to signify their agreement or presence. This might be a simple egg, a personal symbol, or a unique sign. When a document was signed, often in the presence of witnesses, the act of making that mark was a powerful legal and social affirmation. Even if the person could not read the entire document, they understood that by making their mark they were legally binding themselves to its contents. The process of the document being read aloud, the witnessing, and the marking all contributed to the legal validity, making the transaction legitimate even for those who could not personally read the text. The mark represented their assent, their voice, their participation in the legal process. They were not excluded from the legal system simply because they could not write. The concept of reading itself was also more fluid in the Middle Ages. It was not always about silent, individual comprehension as we understand it today. Often, reading was an oral activity, where a text was read aloud, either by one person to a group or by a single individual to themselves in a way that involved vocalizing the words. This public or semi-public nature of reading meant that others were often present and could hear the content, even if they were not the primary reader. This communal experience of reading blurred the lines between literate and illiterate, allowing for shared understanding and discussion of written materials. Someone might read a text by having it recited to them repeatedly until they memorized parts of it, effectively internalizing the written word without ever having deciphered it on their own. Finally, the very structure of medieval society provided a context for understanding documents. People understood their roles, their rights, and their obligations through established customs and oral traditions. When a written document, like a contract or a charter, codified these existing understandings, it was often easier for people to grasp its meaning because it resonated with what they already knew about their social and legal world. They might not parse every legal clause, but they understood the overall intent and effect, particularly if it was explained in terms they recognized. Their knowledge of their community, their feudal lord, or their guild's practices provided a framework for interpreting written information, even if they were relying on others to be the actual words. So, the idea that illiteracy meant total exclusion from the world of written information is a simplification. Medieval society developed sophisticated ways to bridge the gap between written texts and non-literate populations. Through public readings, personal intermediaries, visual cues, symbolic marks, and the communal nature of understanding. People who could not read or write for themselves were still very much part of the world of written communication. They were not passive recipients, but active participants interpreting, understanding, and even influencing the content of documents through the social and legal mechanisms available to them. The script scramble was more like a well-orchestrated dance, where different roles and abilities combined to make the written word accessible and able for everyone. Number 4. Latin only labyrinth. Common image that often comes to mind when thinking about medieval texts is a dusty ancient book written entirely in Latin. This leads to the misconception that Latin was the only language of writing during the Middle Ages, or at least the only language of serious writing. The thought is that all important documents, all scholarly works, all church texts, and all legal decrees were locked away in this ancient dead language, making them utterly inaccessible to the vast majority of people who spoke only their local everyday tongue. This viewpoint suggests that anyone who did not have a classical education in Latin, typically a privilege of the clergy or a very small elite, was completely shut out from any form of written communication that mattered. It implies a kind of linguistic prison where vernacular languages were relegated to mere spoken chatter, never quite making the leap to the permanence and authority of the written word. This perspective imagines a world where the only real literature or documentation existed in a language that was foreign to the common person, creating a massive intellectual and practical barrier for anyone not fluent in Latin. But this notion that Latin was the solitary written language, or even the dominant one for all purposes, is a significant misrepresentation of the diverse linguistic landscape of the medieval period. While Latin certainly held a privileged and extremely important position, particularly in the church, in higher education, and in international diplomacy, it was far from the only language committed to parchment or paper. Vernacular languages, the everyday languages spoken by the people, like Old English, Old French, Middle High German, Old Norse, and many others, were increasingly used for a wide array of written purposes, especially as the Middle Ages progressed. The linguistic reality was a vibrant tapestry of interaction between Latin and the evolving local tongues, each serving distinct yet sometimes overlapping functions. For centuries, Latin was indeed the language of the church, the language of scholarship, and the language of international law and administration across Western Europe. Monasteries copied Latin texts, universities taught in Latin, and official communications between rulers often took place in Latin. This was a legacy of the Roman Empire, and its continued use provided a valuable lingua franca, a common tongue for intellectuals and officials across disparate kingdoms. However, even during the early medieval period, the seeds of vernacular writing were being sown. Early examples of glosses, notes explaining Latin words, in vernacular languages, and even full texts begin to appear. These early steps laid the groundwork for the explosion of vernacular written culture that would characterize the later Middle Ages. As the Middle Ages progressed, especially from the 12th and 13th centuries onwards, the practical needs of a developing society spurred a significant increase in the use of vernacular languages in written form. Take, for instance, legal documents. While some high-level legal records continued to be in Latin, many local court records, property deeds, wills, and contracts were increasingly written in the local language. When a peasant bought a piece of land, or a townsman drew up his will, or a local court settled a dispute, the documents generated often needed to be understood by the parties involved, who spoke only the vernacular. It made practical sense for these documents to be in the language of the people who would interact with them directly. Imagine a village notary trying to explain a complex Latin deed to a group of illiterate farmers. It would be far more effective to have the document itself in the language they understood. This was not just about convenience. It was about ensuring legal clarity and enforceability within local communities. Commerce also played a massive role in the rise of vernacular literacy. Merchants trading across different regions, and often with people who did not speak Latin, needed to keep precise records, write letters, and draw up agreements in the languages of trade. Count books, Ledgers, bills of lading, and business correspondence were frequently written in the vernaculars of the trading centers. Whether that was Italian for Florentine bankers, German for Hanseatic merchants, or French for Parisian traders. These were practical tools of daily business, not high-minded scholarly texts, and their utility depended on being understood by a wide range of literate individuals, many of whom had no formal Latin training. A merchant's ledger had to be immediately understandable by the merchant himself, his clerks, and his apprentices, all of whom might speak a dialect of a local language. Beyond the practical, the world of literature underwent a profound transformation. The Middle Ages were incredibly rich in vernacular literature, from epic poems to romances, lyrical poetry, fables, and even prose narratives. Think of the Old English epic, Beowulf, or the Old French Song of Roland, or the German Nibelungenlied. These monumental works were composed and transmitted in the vernacular languages of their respective regions, not in Latin. Later, the works of towering figures like Dante, Alighieri, writing in Italian, Geoffrey Chaucer writing in Middle English, and Christine de Pizan writing in French represent a pinnacle of vernacular literary achievement. These authors deliberately chose their native tongues to reach a broader audience, to elevate their languages, and to express themes that resonated with the everyday lives and experiences of their contemporaries. They were not writing for a Latin-educated elite. They were writing for nobles, for townspeople, for anyone who could read or have their works read to them in their own language. Even in religious contexts, while the liturgy remained in Latin, there was a growing demand for vernacular religious texts, especially for personal devotion. Books of Hours, which were popular prayer books, often contained prayers and meditations in the vernacular alongside Latin texts. Vernacular translations of parts of the Bible, though sometimes controversial, also circulated, allowing lay people to engage with sacred scripture in their own language. Mystical texts, sermons, and moral treatises were also frequently composed in the vernacular to reach a wider, non-clerical audience, allowing for a more personal and accessible spiritual life. Furthermore, governmental administration, particularly at the local and regional levels, increasingly adopted vernacular languages for record-keeping and communication. Royal courts, city councils, and even parish registers began to utilize the local language for administrative purposes. This was part of a broader trend towards the consolidation of national identities and the establishment of more centralized bureaucracies which found it more efficient and effective to operate in the language of the people they governed. The proliferation of written documents in vernaculars was a testament to their growing status and utility. The development of new scripts and writing practices also supported this shift. Scribes began to develop more standardized and legible forms of vernacular writing, making it easier to produce and consume texts in languages other than Latin. This practical evolution was driven by the increasing demand for written materials in everyday languages. In summary, while Latin undoubtedly held a powerful and enduring presence throughout the Middle Ages, especially in specific domains like high theology, international law, and university scholarship, it was by no means the sole language of writing. The rise and widespread use of vernacular languages in legal documents, commercial records, administrative papers, and, perhaps most notably, in a rich and diverse body of literature, fundamentally reshapes our understanding of medieval literacy. It shows a dynamic linguistic environment where the written word was increasingly adapted to serve the needs and aspirations of everyday people, not just a learned elite. The medieval world was a linguistic melting pot, and its written output reflected this vibrant diversity, far from being a Latin-only labyrinth. Number 3. Ladies in the lurch. There is a stubborn misconception that women in the Middle Ages were almost universally illiterate, completely excluded from any form of education, and that their lives revolved solely around domestic chores with no access to books or the intellectual world. This popular belief paints a picture of medieval women as entirely reliant on men for any interaction with the written word, locked out of literacy by societal norms and a lack of opportunity. It implies that formal education, even at its most basic level, was exclusively reserved for men, and that any woman who could read or write was an extreme rarity, an anomaly rather than a recognizable, if sometimes limited, part of society. This perspective often suggests that women's roles were so strictly confined to the home and family that literacy was simply not deemed necessary or appropriate for them, creating an intellectual void in their lives. However, this notion is far too simplistic and overlooks a rich and varied landscape of female literacy and intellectual engagement throughout the medieval period. While it is true that opportunities for women to acquire literacy varied significantly depending on their social status, geographic location, and specific historical period, it is simply not accurate to say that women were universally illiterate. Many women, from queens to nuns to townswomen, engaged with the written word in diverse and meaningful ways, demonstrating that literacy was not an exclusive male domain. Their access to reading and writing was often tied to their social functions, their religious devotion, or their economic needs, challenging the idea of a monolithic illiteracy among medieval women. Let us start at the very top of the social ladder: aristocratic and royal women. These women often received a formal education which included reading and writing, sometimes in multiple languages like Latin and their native vernacular. Queens, duchesses, and countesses frequently managed vast estates, oversaw large households, and engaged in political correspondence. To do this effectively, they needed to be able to read and write letters, examine financial accounts, and understand legal documents related to their lands and titles. Many noble women acted as regents for their young sons or absent husbands, a role that absolutely demanded strong administrative and communicative skills, including literacy. Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most powerful women of the Middle Ages, was highly educated, patronized poets, and engaged in extensive diplomatic correspondence. Other noble women, like Blanche of Castile, regent of France, demonstrated formidable administrative skills that would have been impossible without literacy. Their education was seen as crucial for their roles in governance and dynastic management. Moving to the religious sphere, convents and nunneries were incredibly important centers of female literacy and learning. For many women, entering the monastic order was the primary path to formal education and intellectual pursuits. Nuns were expected to read Latin for their divine offices, to study sacred texts, and often to engage in copying manuscripts, illuminating texts, and even composing their own works. Visionaries, mystics, and abbesses like Hildegard of Bingen, one of the most remarkable polymaths of the 12th century, wrote extensively on theology, natural science, medicine, and music. Others, like Julian of Norwich, penned profound mystical texts in the vernacular. These women were not only literate, but were prolific writers and thinkers, contributing significantly to medieval intellectual life. Convents often maintained libraries and functioned as schools, providing a structured environment where women could learn to read and write, not just for religious devotion but for scholarly and administrative purposes within their communities. Even among urban middle-class women, especially in the later Middle Ages, literacy was more common than often assumed. Daughters of merchants, artisans, and prosperous townspeople often learned to read, primarily for practical reasons related to managing household finances, assisting in family businesses, and engaging in personal religious devotion. A merchant's wife might keep accounts, handle correspondence, or even run the family business in her husband's absence, tasks that would be greatly facilitated by literacy. Guilds, particularly those related to textiles and crafts, sometimes had female members or heads who would have needed to read and write for business purposes. There are records of women signing contracts, engaging in legal disputes, and conducting business transactions in towns, all activities that often implied some level of literacy. Personal religious practice also encouraged literacy. Many women owned and read books of hours, which were popular prayer books, often containing vernacular texts as well as Latin. While formal schooling was less accessible for girls compared to boys, private tutoring and informal education within the home were common. Girls learned from their mothers, from older female relatives, or from private tutors. The very act of managing a household, particularly a large one, required a degree of record-keeping and understanding of written instructions, which could encourage or even demand some level of literacy. The ability to read recipes, medicinal texts, or household inventories was also beneficial. It is important to acknowledge that the type of literacy varied. Not all women were writing philosophical treatises or Latin sermons. Many might have had a more functional literacy, meaning they could read letters, personal documents, and simple accounts, even if they were not capable of writing complex prose. The ability to read without the ability to write was also common, as was the ability to read and write in a vernacular language, but not in Latin. These different levels of literacy are often overlooked when we apply a modern monolithic definition of literacy to the medieval past. Furthermore, the late medieval period saw a rise in devotional literature and popular romances in the vernacular, which were often read by women. Many women found entertainment and spiritual guidance in these texts, and their growing availability in local languages contributed to an increase in female readership. Patronage of books and authors by women also indicates their engagement with the written word, not just as readers, but as active participants in the literary culture of their time. The idea that women were entirely absent from the world of writing and reading is a persistent but inaccurate stereotype. While their opportunities and the scope of their literacy might have differed from those of men, medieval women across various social strata demonstrably engaged with the written word for practical, religious, and intellectual purposes. They were not simply in the lurch, but were active participants in the literate cultures of their time, leaving behind a wealth of evidence that challenges the narrow view of female illiteracy. Number 2. Brains on pause. Here is a common frustrating misconception: that being illiterate in the Middle Ages automatically meant you were unintelligent, simple-minded, or somehow less capable of complex thought. This idea suggests that anyone who could not read or write was essentially ignorant, unable to engage in sophisticated reasoning or understand the world beyond the most basic level. It implies that literacy was the sole gateway to knowledge and wisdom, and that without it, your brain was somehow on pause, unable to develop or function at a high level. This perspective often leads to a condescending view of medieval people who could not read, dismissing their contributions to society and their capacity for deep understanding. It paints illiteracy as a marker of intellectual inferiority, a fundamental deficit in cognitive ability, rather than a social or educational circumstance. However, this is a profoundly mistaken understanding of intelligence and knowledge in any historical period, especially the Middle Ages. Being illiterate in no way meant a person lacked intelligence, wisdom, or the ability to think critically and creatively. Knowledge and intelligence were acquired and expressed in countless ways that did not rely on the written word, and many highly intelligent, capable, and influential individuals were not formally literate in the way we understand it today. The medieval world valued many forms of knowledge and intelligence, much of which was transmitted and applied through oral traditions, practical skills, and direct experience. Consider the craftspeople and artisans: a master carpenter, a skilled stonemason, an expert weaver, or a brilliant blacksmith possessed an immense amount of knowledge and intellectual capability. They understood complex geometric principles, material properties, structural integrity, and intricate design. A mason might instinctively know how to cut and place stones to create a magnificent arch that would stand for centuries, a skill that required deep understanding of physics and engineering, even if they had no written textbooks. A weaver could produce incredibly complex patterns and fabrics, requiring mathematical precision and artistic vision without needing to read a diagram. These were not simple rote tasks. They were highly skilled professions, demanding innovative, problem-solving, abstract thinking, and years of accumulated practical wisdom. This knowledge was often passed down through apprenticeship, observation, and oral instruction, demonstrating a vibrant intellectual life that bypassed formal literacy. Their brains were most certainly not on pause. They were actively engaged in shaping the physical world around them. Think about the farmers and peasants who made up the vast majority of the population. They possessed an intricate, detailed knowledge of their environment, the seasons, weather patterns, soil types, animal husbandry, and crop rotation. They understood complex ecological systems, how to manage water, when to plant and harvest, and how to preserve food. This was not mere survival instinct. It was a sophisticated body of agricultural science accumulated over generations, often transmitted orally through proverbs, songs, and communal practices. They made intelligent decisions about their livelihoods every day, adapting to changing conditions, managing resources, and ensuring the survival of their communities. Their understanding of the natural world and their practical solutions to agricultural challenges demonstrate a profound intelligence and problem-solving ability, entirely independent of reading or writing. Leaders, even those not formally literate, could be exceptionally astute and wise. Many medieval rulers, military commanders, and local community leaders relied on their understanding of human nature, their strategic thinking, their memory, and their ability to persuade and negotiate. Powerful feudal lord might not have been able to read Latin, but he could be a brilliant military strategist, an astute politician, and an effective administrator of his lands and people. He would employ literate clerks and advisors, but he would make the ultimate decisions based on his own judgment, intelligence, and understanding of the situation. His wisdom came from experience, observation, and interaction, not from books alone. Oral history, storytelling, and the art of rhetoric were highly valued skills in medieval society, and mastery of these forms required significant intellectual prowess. Storytelling, poetry, and music were vibrant parts of medieval culture, and these forms of expression required immense intellectual and creative ability. Bards, minstrels, and poets traveled from court to court, entertaining and informing with epic tales, lyrical poems, and satirical verses. These performers possessed incredible memories, rhetorical skill, and an ability to connect with their audiences, shaping narratives and conveying complex emotions and ideas, all without necessarily relying on written scripts. The oral transmission of these cultural forms demonstrates a society rich in intellectual life that did not depend on written literacy. The very structure of oral epic poems, with their repeated phrases and formulaic expressions, was designed to aid memory and oral performance, choosing a different kind of sophisticated knowledge organization. Legal systems, while increasingly relying on written documents, also had a strong oral component. Many legal principles were based on custom and tradition, passed down through generations of oral discourse and observed practices. Judges and jurors, even if illiterate, could possess a deep understanding of local laws, precedents, and the nuances of justice. They would listen to testimonies, weigh evidence, and render judgments based on their experience and the community's collective wisdom. The legal process often involved public testimony and oral arguments, emphasizing the importance of spoken word and the ability to articulate complex legal situations without necessarily reading them. Their understanding of right and wrong, of social contracts, and of dispute resolution was a complex intellectual feat not limited by their reading ability. The ability to memorize vast amounts of information was a highly valued intellectual skill in the Middle Ages. In a world where books were rare and expensive and personal literacy was not universal, memory played a crucial role in knowledge transmission. People memorized genealogies, legal precedents, religious texts, epic poems, and practical advice. This required a trained and highly capable mind, a different kind of intelligence than what we associate with reading a modern text. Those who could retain and accurately recall large bodies of information were seen as learned and wise, even if they never penned a single word. So the idea that illiteracy somehow equates to a brain on pause is fundamentally flawed. It misinterprets the nature of intelligence, knowledge, and learning in a pre-modern context. Medieval society valued and fostered a diverse array of intellectual capabilities, many of which were transmitted and expressed through oral traditions, practical skills, and direct experience. The intelligence of a master craftsman, a wise farmer, a strategic leader, or a captivating storyteller was evident in their actions, their creations, and their understanding of the world, entirely independent of their ability to read or write. They were not simple or ignorant. They were intelligent individuals, navigating their complex world with sophisticated knowledge and skills, proving that brains were certainly not on pause. Number 1. No need for knowledge. There is a widespread idea that the Middle Ages was a period where widespread literacy was simply not necessary. The misconception often suggests that medieval society was so primitive, so static, and so focused on manual labor or basic survival that there was no practical or compelling reason for the average person to learn to read or write. This view implies that literacy was a luxury, a decorative skill for a select few scholars or clergy, but not a fundamental tool for the vast majority of people. It suggests that daily life was so uncomplicated, so unchanging, that the benefits of reading and writing were marginal, and that the society functioned perfectly well without its citizens being widely literate. This perspective often leads to the conclusion that if literacy was rare, it was because there was no practical demand for it, thus framing the Middle Ages as a time of intellectual stagnancy or indifference to personal knowledge. This perception profoundly underestimates the dynamism, complexity, and practical needs of medieval society. Far from being a luxury, literacy, in its various forms and degrees, was an increasingly valuable and often essential tool across many aspects of medieval life. The idea that there was no need for knowledge, in the sense of written knowledge, ignores the fundamental ways in which written communication facilitated governance, commerce, law, and even personal and religious life. Medieval society, particularly as it evolved into the High and Late Middle Ages, was far from static. It was growing, developing, and becoming more administratively sophisticated, creating a growing demand for the written word. Let us dig into the undeniable needs that spurred literacy. Governance and administration, from the grand scale of kingdoms to the local level of manors and towns, relied heavily on written documents. Kings and queens needed to issue charters, decrees, and laws to govern their realms. How else would royal commands be transmitted reliably across vast distances? How would taxes be assessed and collected without written records of landholdings and obligations? Royal chanceries produced an enormous volume of letters, treaties, and legal documents. Similarly, feudal lords needed written records to manage their estates, keep track of their tenants, and enforce their rights. A manor court might rely on written rolls to record disputes, judgments, and land transfers. The very structure of feudal society, with its complex web of allegiances and obligations, often found its foundation in written agreements and charters. The efficient running of any large medieval entity, be it a kingdom or an estate, required a literate bureaucracy, not just a few isolated scholars. Without the ability to create, read, and interpret these documents, the machinery of medieval governance would have ground to a halt. Commerce was another powerful driver of literacy. As trade routes expanded and towns grew into bustling economic centers, merchants faced increasingly complex transactions. Imagine a merchant in Bruges trading textiles with a partner in Florence. They could not rely on memory or purely oral agreements for transactions involving large sums of money, multiple parties, and long distances. They needed written contracts, bills of exchange, letters of credit, and detailed account books. These documents provided security, facilitated credit, and resolved disputes. Business partnerships, loans, and international trade networks would have been impossible without written communication. The Hanseatic League, a powerful confederation of merchant guilds, relied extensively on written rules, agreements, and correspondence to manage its vast trading empire across northern Europe. Even within individual towns, artisans and craftsmen, especially those who ran their own businesses, needed to keep track of sales, purchases, and debts. While not every artisan was a master scribe, many had functional literacy necessary for their trade, or employed someone who did. The very existence of a thriving medieval economy demonstrates a significant practical need for written communication. The legal system also demanded literacy, while oral traditions remained important. Medieval law increasingly relied on written records. Property, deeds, wills, marriage contracts, and court judgments were committed to parchment to ensure clarity, permanence, and enforceability. These documents provided indisputable evidence in disputes and secured rights for generations. Lawyers, notaries, and court officials were essential figures in medieval society, and their profession was entirely built upon their ability to read, write, and interpret legal texts. Even for the average person, understanding the implications of a land deed or a last will and testament was crucial, even if it meant having it read aloud and explained by a literate intermediary. The shift towards more sophisticated written legal systems reflected a society that recognized the practical benefits of documentation for justice and order. Even within religious life, beyond the monastic scholarly pursuits, there was a growing need for literacy. Parish priests needed to be able to read liturgical texts, administer sacraments, and keep parish records of births, deaths, and marriages. As mentioned earlier, the popularity of books of hours and other devotional texts in the vernacular indicates a demand from the laity for personal religious engagement that went beyond simply listening to sermons. For individuals, particularly women, these personal prayer books offered a direct connection to their faith, fostering a form of personal literacy for spiritual nourishment. The rise of new religious orders and movements also often involved the production and dissemination of written materials for their followers. Furthermore, education itself was not solely confined to the church or the elite. While formal schooling was not universal, as societies became more complex, the need for literate individuals in various professions grew. Urban grammar schools began to emerge, teaching boys and sometimes girls the basics of reading and writing, not necessarily for a clerical career, but for future roles in administration, commerce, or other professions. These schools were a direct response to a societal need for literate professionals, showing that literacy was not seen as an impractical pursuit. The development of universities which trained scholars in law, medicine, and theology further underscored the societal demand for advanced literacy and intellectual development. Finally, the very act of record-keeping, across all levels of society, shows a profound recognition of the need for knowledge in a written form. From royal exchequers, meticulously documenting revenues to individual households, keeping inventories, written records, provided accountability, historical memory, and a basis for future planning. These were not intellectual exercises for their own sake. They were practical tools for managing resources, ensuring continuity, and navigating an increasingly complex world. The persistent creation and preservation of countless charters, account rolls, letters, and chronicles are testament to a society that profoundly valued the written word as a necessary instrument for its functioning and development. So, the notion that the Middle Ages had no need for knowledge in the form of widespread literacy is a fundamental misjudgment. It ignores the intricate governmental structures, the dynamic commercial networks, the evolving legal systems, and the personal and religious needs that continuously drove the demand for reading and writing. Far from being a static or intellectually indifferent period, the Middle Ages were a time of increasing complexity and sophistication, where literacy in its varied forms was a vital and practical tool for navigating the world ensuring order, facilitating progress, and recording the very history of its people. The need for knowledge was not absent, it was woven into the very fabric of medieval life.